Microsoft Azure Active Directory Multi-Factor Authentication Deployment Overview. What I want to do in this video is just highlight some of the planning that needs to take place before you actually consider deploying the Microsoft Azure Active Directory MFA solution. It's a very high level overview. I have included some links at the end of this presentation which I will share on my website as well. So you may want to look a little bit further into some of the things that I'm going to point out in this overview. So some of the things you need to think about when looking at deploying Microsoft's MFA solution, and more than likely most MFA solutions out there are probably going to fall in line with this, is essentially how it's going to be deployed and the authentication methods. So when we typically think of a deployment scenario for multi-factor authentication, we need to first understand our environment, and that leads us to looking at kind of what sort of environment we have. You know, is that environment a cloud only environment? So are all the applications that your employees or your organization accessing in the cloud somewhere, so the authentication is performed in the cloud? Or is it more of an hybrid approach in that, you know, you have some applications situated on sites, or, you know, across multiple sites on premise, and then you have some applications that you access which are in the cloud. And then lastly, some organizations still may be on-premise only, so all the applications or the resources that they're looking to protect are actually on-premise and not in the cloud environment. And the reason this is key is because we first need to see what sort of applications we're going to protect and where they're located, and what sort of authentication methods can be used in order to protect them. And more so, are the applications, depending on where they're located and how they've been developed, even supported? So that kind of leads me on to the authentication methods as well. So when looking at multi-factor authentication solutions, you tend to see different supported authentication methods, and I've got a few here that Microsoft support. So we've got SMS, we've got voice, we've got push and sign in using the mobile app. We have software and hardware based one-time passcodes, and then we've got the more popular approach right now, which is the biometrics for two-factor authentication. And depending on your environment or the applications you're looking to protect, you may find that, you know, one is suitable over the other, or depending on, you know, what security policies you have in place, you may decide that you're only going to use, say for instance, the push authentication via a mobile device, and maybe passwordless as well, and decide not to use voice and SMS because they're probably the least secure ones available. It all depends on the organization, the end users, and ultimately how you want to secure access to applications. More information around the authentication methods can be found on Microsoft's website, and I believe I've included a link at the end of this presentation that you can go ahead and check out more about as well. So once we've decided, where the applications are, on-premise, hybrid or cloud, and we've kind of got an idea of the sort of authentication methods we want to use, we then need to decide how we're actually going to protect these resources. We need to look at things such as, how on-premise systems will be protected, especially if they're custom applications that are being built in-house. We need to look at sort of what authentication they support, how they actually authenticate users. Is it local, or are they using some sort of identity provider? Do they authenticate directly with Azure's Active Directory using things such as SAML or WAF? Or if not, what other options are available? Let's say for instance you've got an application that doesn't support SAML, but you really want to protect that with two-factor authentication. How is that going to be done? Does Microsoft support that sort of does Microsoft have a mechanism to implement two-factor authentication before getting access to that specific application? And they've got a few different options, and again it depends on the application itself and the environment, but there's a few options available. One of those is Azure Active Directory application proxy. The other is by using, say for instance, a network policy server. If your application supports some sort of radius authentication, Microsoft has an extension, an Azure MFA extension, that can be tied into an MPS in order to provide that multi-factor authentication. Or one way that is recommended by Microsoft is actually to use ADFS, which is essentially federating the domain or your domain with Azure Active Directory as well. Now that might not be a suitable option for all environments, all organizations that want to make use of Azure's multi-factor authentication. So again, it's worth planning and taking a look at the applications that you want to protect, how users authenticate with those applications, before deciding whether or not Microsoft can actually support multi-factor authentication on top of those. It's worth noting though that Azure Active Directory does support Azure Active Directory multi-factor authentication, that is, does support third-party applications, but from what I've kind of looked into as of now, it is slightly more limited when comparing it to other multi-factor authentication solutions that exist in the market today, and that's because they don't seem to support custom applications that may require the use of an SDK or APIs as well. So do bear that in mind. Conditional access policies is essentially a license feature from Microsoft, and it's the recommended way, at least by Microsoft, to actually deploy multi-factor authentication. Now, I'm not going to go into the licensing in this overview. I will look at doing a quick overview around the licensing for Microsoft's MFA solution in another video. But in short, CA policies, when referring to them in the context of Azure Active Directory for multi-factor authentication, allow us to enforce two-factor authentication for users based on configured conditions, and similarly allow us to disregard multi-factor authentication, say for certain applications where it may not be required. You can get really granular with the creation of the policies. And I think that's why it's really recommended that if an organization is looking to deploy Azure's Active Directory MFA solution, that conditional access is used. So when planning a deployment, it's important that you take a look at the use cases that you are looking to implement. And by use cases, maybe start to look at how admin accounts are protected, if there is admin accounts or executive accounts, because these tend to be targets for attack, and the reason is because they often have the most privileges assigned to them. So if those accounts are breached, then it's more than likely the attacker is going to get access to quite a lot, providing they can move laterally around the network. So conditional access allows us to really get granular with the policies and look at maybe creating a certain policy for user groups that are admins and execs, or even look at protecting critical applications as opposed to applications that don't necessarily need to be protected with multi-factor authentication. There's also the ability with conditional access to look at things like location-based access as well as things like risk-based access too. So it's well worth, when looking at deploying Microsoft's MFA solution, to explore conditional access and to see whether that would be a solution to your requirements when dealing with MFA. And lastly, it's important to, and the reason I kind of say that is because the last point there kind of sums it up, in that not all access should be flat. So by that I mean you shouldn't have, or you should make sure that policies are as granular as possible. Creating one flat policy for every single user is more than likely not going to be sufficient, and you're not really going to get the best out of what multi-factor authentication vendors can offer today as well. So make sure you take a look at CA if you're looking at more granular multi-factor authentication. Lastly, when we look at the Azure Active Directory multi-factor authentication solution, we see that there is also the ability to gather and view reports, as well as monitor existing authentication events that have come in as well. And you can monitor things such as the authentication event itself, the method that's being used to authenticate, the conditional access policies that are being used, if any have been used, as well as the timestamps and dates and IP addresses as well. And if you as an administrator want to be able to download that and share it with execs or the security team, there is the ability to be able to download that activity report in a CSV format as well, to share for further viewing as well. So that's a quick overview of the planning around, or some of the considerations to think about when planning the deployment of Azure's Active Directory multi-factor authentication. I've included some links here, which I will share the presentation on my website as well. So I do urge you to take a further look at that in more detail, because this video is just kind of to get you thinking about some of the things that you may need to take into consideration before jumping straight in and deploying the solution.